Of course, we have to include Rumiko Takahashi, who is one of, if not maybe even the most successful manga artist of all time. In the mid 70s, she attended a manga school that was run by Kazuo Koike, who was the artist behind the seminal manga series Lone Wolf and Cub, and we'll be talking about that one more later. And beginning in the late 70s, she has achieved an enormous amount of success, way beyond the confines of Japan, and much of her stuff has been adapted to anime. I think that I read 200 million copies of her books are in print worldwide. Well, now let's also take a look at some women who have operated outside the boundaries of serial comic books, and more in line with what has come to be known, what would come to be known as graphic novels. So let's start with Linda Berry. In the late 70s, Berry was a fine arts major at the Evergreen State College in Olympia, Washington. And that's when she started doing comic strips, mostly as kind of a form of self-therapy, but she shared them with some of her friends, including a fellow student named Matt Groening, who later would go on to create The Simpsons. Groening and the editor of the University of Washington Daily, John Keister, ran her cartoons, her strip, calling it Ernie Pook's Comic, and it took off. And before long, it was in 70 newspapers nationwide. And throughout the 1980s, there were several collections of the comic strips that were published. She also, in 1988, wrote an illustrated novel, as she called it, The Good Times Are Killing Me. And it was, in fact, an illustrated novel. It was kind of a conventional sort of young adult novel with the kind of a splash page illustration at the beginning of each chapter, and that was made into a play. She did more of those, and then later started doing graphic novels, including 100 Demons. That was sort of a memoir, and more that she has done since. Alison Bechdel made a huge splash in 2006 with her autobiographical graphic novel, Fun Home, which several years later was made into a musical, which in 2015 won the Tony Award for Best Musical and was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize for Drama. Bechdel also originated the term, what has come to be called the Bechdel test. That is a test to measure the how well women are represented in a fictional work. And essentially, the test is, are there at least two women in this work of fiction, whether it be a book or a movie or whatever, are there at least two women, preferably with names, who talk with one another at some point about anything other than a man or the actions of a man? And that seems pretty simple, but perhaps not surprisingly, large number of fictional works fail that test. All right, next let's take a look at Marjane Satrapi, whose work Persepolis was based on her Iranian family's struggles in Iran when she was very young, and then also in Europe after they successfully left Iran. And this is a very, very powerful work, as is the previous one by Bechdel. Also a very powerful work more recently from 2017 by the Vietnamese American artist T. Bui, the best we could do. And this also is a memoir, kind of similar to Persepolis, in that it is about immigration, and in this case, it follows Thi Bui's Vietnamese family and their travails in Vietnam and efforts to get to the United States, and then what happened after that. I got to meet Thi Bui at a conference a couple of years ago. Anyway, this is just a very very small sampling. Even if I were to try to think of female writers and artists who have had extremely significant works as graphic novels over the last 20 years, it could take up an entire one of these lectures. So again, this is just an overview, but I encourage you to learn more. And it's a similar situation with traditional comic books, and that is demonstrated with this three-part anthology series that Marvel put out in 2010, Girl Comics. Now, there had actually been a title, Girl Comics, put out by Timely, I think, starting in 1949 at the peak of the romance trend. And so they used that name again, although clearly it's in a different context. And initially, it was this event was supposed to be a celebration of the 30th anniversary of the creation of the She-Hulk, who's there on the cover of issue number 1. But what they decided to do was just celebrate women in comics beyond just She-Hulk. And so this three-part anthology series, the editor and all the associate editors, all the writers and all the artists and all the colorists and all the letterers were all women. Now, all the stories didn't center on women. Some of the stories centered on male Marvel characters, but they were completely done by women. And when I said that this demonstrates something similar to what I was saying about women in graphic novels in the last 20 years, there was no shortage of women to work on these stories. So each issue of this probably had like 5 short stories in it, so roughly around 15 in all, and it includes some of the women who are begun work more recently, like 21st century, whose names I have there, like Colleen Coover, who I think did the frontispiece, the front illustration. I'm pretty sure she did. Devin Grayson, Amanda Connor, Jill Thompson, Molly Crabapple, Marjorie Liu, who has really gotten a lot of positive attention, and Stephanie Buscema, who is the granddaughter of John Buscema, who was one of Marvel's main artists for decades, and who had in fact worked on the first issue of Girl Comics back in 1949. Anyway, in addition to them, also some of the old guard of women creators were involved in this project, including Trina Robbins, Louise Simonson, and Nocenti and Ramona Fradon. So in fact, Trina Robbins' story was written by Trina Robbins, illustrated by Stephanie Buscema. In addition to that, each issue had 3 kind of 2-page spreads that were a little mini biography of major women in the history of Marvel Comics. And so that was 9 in all. And here's who they spotlighted: Marie Severin, Flo Steinberg, June Tarpe Mills, Ruth Atkinson, Valerie Barclay, Linda Fite, Louise Simonson, Ann Nocenti, and Glennis Oliver, all people that we have just talked about. So I've kind of had a difficult time putting this last part together, because I want to highlight all the significant women artists and writers that are in the field now that have come on the scene since, well, in the last 30 years, since 1990. And there's just so many that I feel like I could go on forever. And so I have to sort of draw a line here somewhere and encourage you to find out more about these women that I have listed here that worked. And this isn't even all the women that worked on this project. But I do want to mention one female artist in particular who is working currently, and that is Fiona Staples. She has received a lot of critical acclaim in the last decade. I'm talking about the 2010s. In fact, there are plenty of people who would argue that she may well be the best artist working in comics right now. She's the one who redesigned Archie over there on the far right for Archie Comics. And also, she's the artist for the science fiction comic book Saga, which has been one of the most critically acclaimed comic book series of the last 10 years. So, a big difference from when we're talking about, especially we're talking about like the 1950s and 60s. There was a serious shortage of women creators at that time. Not that there was a shortage of women who were qualified or of women who wanted to do it, but as we saw, those women, many of them got a shot during World War II, but then they were sort of cut off from the profession. All right, well, let's turn our attention back now to characters. Well, we've talked quite a bit about the female superheroes of the 1940s and 50s. Let's take a look now at some of the female superheroes of the Silver Age, and some of these are from the Bronze Age, the early Bronze Age, which started around the mid 1970s. But let me just identify these characters for you, though you probably recognize some of them. Going from left to right, you've got Batwoman. Then you've got Supergirl on top, Spider-Woman on the bottom. You got Batgirl, the She-Hulk. You have the Wasp. You have Aquagirl from DC Comics. And right next to her, virtually the same powers and origin and everything, you have Namorita, who is supposed to be the daughter of Namora, which, I don't know, does that make her the second cousin of the Submariner, or is it his first cousin once removed? I don't know. And then the upper right, you've got Ms. Marvel, who would later become Captain Marvel, as we talked about, but not for a long time. Okay, now, do you detect a theme here? What do these characters have in common? These are several of the major female characters from Marvel and DC from that era, that were created in that era. And every one of these, at least, is actually a female version of an already existing male hero, right? Batman and Superman, Spider-Man, the Hulk. Now, there is no male Wasp, but the Wasp was the partner and eventually the wife of Ant-Man and the Wasp. So, same bug theme, and Ant-Man came first, right? And Carol Danvers one day became Captain Marvel, but there was already the original Marvel Captain Marvel running around Marvel at that time. So, very little in the lines of original identities. So the idea of being secondary is almost inherent in the very nature of these particular characters. Also debuting at Marvel Comics in the early 1960s, these two individuals, not the Invisible Woman or Marvel Woman, but the Invisible Girl and Marvel Girl. Now, bear in mind, Spider-Man, who showed up actually about a year after the Invisible Girl, was supposed to have been like 15 years old But he's not Spider-Boy. He's Spider-Man. Remember how we talked about the Human Torch is supposed to be roughly the same age as Spider-Man? The Invisible Girl is the Human Torch's older sister, but she's still the Invisible Girl. She wouldn't get promoted to Invisible Woman for about a quarter of a century until the late 1980s. And then, of course, Marvel Girl, who would be known by that name until the late 70s when she would change her name to Phoenix. You may know her best as Jean Grey from the original X-Men. Now, here's another motif, particularly at Marvel at this time, although there was a little element of this at DC. The idea of bad girls gone good. Now, there were some male heroes also who started off as villains and later turned into heroes. That was kind of a motif of Stan Lee. So here you've got the Black Widow and the Scarlet Witch, and you also have the Black Cat, who didn't show up until 1979 or so in Amazing Spider-Man. All of these initially were super villains, and you may not have known that if you're familiar with the Black Widow from the movies, because she initially was a Russian spy and an enemy of Iron Man, but she defected and became a SHIELD agent. And then the Scarlet Witch and her brother Quicksilver, or Pietro, were originally in Magneto's group of evil mutants, but from the beginning they kind of had conscience issues, and they switched over. The Black Cat was a burglar, clearly modeled on Catwoman, and that's what I was kind of hinting at when I said there was some of this going on at DC. Catwoman was still a villain, but in the TV show, this was really emphasized, but it was in the comics as well. She had a crush on Batman, and he kind of had an attraction to her, but she was bad. Over at Marvel, things weren't as cut and dry as that. So the Black Cat was initially a villain, but Spider-Man still liked her, and they actually wound up being an item for a while when she came over to be on the good guys' side. So all three of these types of things are, so we're looking at like the female version of the pre-existing male superhero. We're looking at the girl sobriquet instead of woman, and we're looking at these kind of bad girls that are brought over to the good side. None of those things, none of those situations exhibit the kind of power, agency, and autonomy that a character like Wonder Woman had in 1941, or even a character like the Phantom Lady back in the 1940s. So in a lot of ways, there'd been a big step backwards. And there also were not as many female heroes in the 60s or the 70s as there had been back in the 40s. In fact, I would argue that it wasn't until Storm came along in 1975 or so that there was finally the introduction of a character with the same qualities that Wonder Woman had had back in 1941. That is to say, she was not a female version of some other character. She was not a reformed criminal, bad girl. She was not called Storm Girl. In fact, she was had at one time been worshipped as a goddess. The problem with Storm, who again came along at the beginning of the Bronze Age, the problem there, though, is that she was not the star of a comic book called Storm. She was one of the X-Men. She was part of a team. So, sure, she was the deputy leader of the team, right? She was the deputy field leader behind Cyclops, and then when he left for a while, she took over as the leader. but it's still as part of an overall team dynamic. So that still doesn't quite qualify as reaching the same level of agency and autonomy as most of the 1940s female superheroes. All right, well, by the early 1990s, there were more women working in comics. There were more female superhero characters. Were things better? Well, judge for yourself. I feel bad about even putting these images up here, but you really need to know what the standard style was across several companies in the early 1990s. This is just what you would see in just about any comic book that you picked up that featured a female character, not as part of the supporting cast. And that's Red Sonja there on the right. And there on the left, Marvel put out an annual swimsuit edition for 5 years in a row from 1991 to 1995. And of course, Red Sonja there, indicative of kind of the norm of the early 90s comic book artist style of having women being drawn disproportionately. This is one of the things that would have violated the comics code back in the 1950s when they said you're not supposed to emphasize any particular physical feature. Now, to be kind of semi-fair, male heroes were also being portrayed in forms that were just physically impossible, but at least they had clothes on. However, with the end of the 1990s and the dawn of the 21st century, in a lot of ways, things did start looking up so far as female representation on the comics page. I mean, you had Gail Simone, just a couple of years after her groundbreaking essay about women in refrigerators. You've got her doing the writing chores on Birds of Prey, which is a superhero group of all women. And there you can see on the front cover on the left, you've got Barbara Gordon, formerly Batgirl, now Oracle in the foreground. You've got Black Canary on the left, the Huntress in the center, and there's Lady Blackhawk over on the right. And there's the Black Canary, Oracle, and the Huntress on the splash page. All characters that we've talked about within the last couple of lectures. So that's going on. Over at Marvel, there's a new character introduced named Jessica Jones, which is kind of a plain name for a superhero. Turns out she used to have a secret superhero identity of Jewel. She's got all these superpowers and everything, but essentially, she is now a private detective, and she kind of drinks a little too much, and she's really kind of rough-hewn, and she swears a lot, and she gets in a lot of fist fights. Essentially, she is a hard-boiled noir private detective character, and she's a woman. And on the far right, you can see her as portrayed for 3 seasons in the Netflix series Jessica Jones. The first season was highly lauded by critics. Kind of with each successive season, the quality went down a little bit, but overall it was still good. Third season introduced the cat, Patsy Walker. Well, in addition to that, right, by the late 20-teens, on the big screen, you had huge blockbuster hits for both DC and for Marvel, with Wonder Woman and Captain Marvel. Came out, within just a few months of one another. Now, the argument had always been that you can't have a female superhero anchoring a movie because the boys won't come see it because it's got a girl in it. And they had tried it once with Supergirl, and that tanked. It tanked because it sucked really, really bad. So that is a factor. These were both very well done. And guess what? Well, the Wonder Woman movie made a lot more money than the Superman versus Batman that came out around the same time. So this kind of disproved that notion that female superheroes can't carry a movie and bring a lot of people in to see it. And there's a lot of, at this point, 2020, when I'm recording this, people are looking forward to seeing the sequels to both of these. Also, at this point, Batwoman is a TV series over on the CW, kind of a little bit in limbo right now in the summer of 2020 because the lead actress, I guess, quit. But anyway, the point is there are plenty, both on the page and on the screen, plenty of good, positive, self-empowered female role models for young girls to see and for young boys to see and not be threatened by women who have that sense of self-empowerment. Could that ever happen? Could boys feel threatened by that? Well, here's something that I bet most of you, unless you follow comic book news closely, and I find that most of the students that take this class have never read a comic book before, so you probably don't. Something called Comicsgate, which is actually kind of a sequel to something called Gamergate that came first. Now, Gamergate you might have heard of. That was in 2014 when a large number of young male gamers, computer gamers, online gamers, whatever kind of gamers whatever they call it nowadays, started this harassment campaign against several women in the gaming industry because they were upset that there were too many women in the gaming industry and they were ruining it. That some of the games they were designing seemed like they were for girls or seemed like maybe they had like girl characters and stuff. And so naturally, people started contacting these female game designers and threatening to rape and kill them. And there was a lot of that, and it was in the news quite a bit. Then, that was 2014, then 2015, 2016, there was something similar that happened in the science fiction community with the same kind of idea. A large number of aggrieved white male science fiction fans got upset that there was too much diversity in science fiction novels and science fiction magazines and movies. Now, these are the same people who got incredibly bent out of shape by the fact that in the new Star Wars movies, the first of which was The Force Awakens, was coming out about that time, had girls in it, and also a black guy, right? That this was ruining their childhood by forcing diversity upon them, as if, right, the original Star Wars movies hadn't had Princess Leia as one of the main characters in Lando Calrissian. That's beside the point. The same thing happened with comics fans starting around 2017. There started to be this sustained movement that was angry white guys. Not all of them young. Some of them were angry white guys who worked in the industry, and some of whom had worked in the industry for a while, who were upset because of all the diversity, of all the empowered female characters that were showing up, all the minorities that were showing up, Captain America being replaced as Captain America by The Falcon, who was black, that freaked him out. Thor, the hammer of Thor being lifted by Jane Foster, Thor's ex-girlfriend, who then gets the power of Thor. That freaked him out. Everything freaked him out. Essentially, everything that wasn't straight white guys performing superheroics. And they were claiming that this liberal agenda was ruining their childhood. Again, as if all through the decades there hadn't been consistent calls, at least for the previous 5 decades, consistent calls for equal treatment for everybody. And as if, from the very beginning, the first Superman stories weren't about Superman protecting the those who were underprivileged in 1930s society. Anyway, the point is, a whole lot of white guys. Now, I say this as a white guy, as a middle-aged white guy. A whole lot of my ilk that do not look at things the way I do, just all been out of shape. I don't think just by entertainment. I think they're been out of shape by the world around them. Like I said, the comic stuff started in 2017. I think that there's just this sense of entitlement and victimhood of a certain segment. I'm not going to say all white males, because I'm a white male and I think they're idiots. But a certain segment who are particularly upset by the increasing number of female writers and artists, and African American men and women, and Asian American men and women, Latinx men and women, and so forth. So is that an improvement? It doesn't seem like it on the surface, but I kind of feel like the fact that there's so much change to the status quo within the pages of the books on both with both the characters and the people creating the characters, the fact it has freaked some comfortable white people out so much, some white males, comfortable white males, freaked them out so much, is a sign things are going in the right direction. And I certainly hope that they continue to do so. And I certainly hope that we continue to see more and more talented, creative women entering the comics industry and writing graphic novels and drawing graphic novels, and that we continue to see strong, self-empowered female characters, whether they're written by women or not, and that, this is an upward trend.